these tours is the sense that French artists in this period were extremely well trained. Beginning in the 17th century, there was a Royal Academy in France where if you were a promising artist, you would compete mercilessly to get into it, to accelerate through the various grades of training that they have. If you were really good, you might be plucked out of your group and sent off to Rome for a couple of years to study what?
Masters.
Yeah, to study those classical ruins, the Colosseum, the paintings by the high Renaissance artists, all those things that you couldn't necessarily find in quantity in France. And that was another way in which artists distinguished themselves, through a kind of ruthless competition with one another to excel and to be identified by their trainers, their teachers, people like Charles Lebrun, who would say, you are so good, you get to go on an all-expense-paid trip to Rome. Prix de Rome. Yeah, right, the Prix de Rome. That was the goal. And so that these artists oftentimes hated one another. I mean, that's probably too strong a word. But when, I'll tell you a little bit more about this later, but when Fragonard won the Prix de Rome, his best friend, Charles Notre, said, you did not paint that painting. That's not your work. Which was a kind of way to, undercut somebody who was being successful, right? And so that was the other theme that I wanted to insert into this exhibition, this kind of cutthroat approach to making art and to excelling in French high culture sort of plays against the carefree, who cares, let's go out and party subject matter that these artists were celebrating in their art. That in fact they were anything but carefree. The stakes were high. They needed to keep working hard and promote their work. Even after their death, there were people who were promoting their work against other artists. And in that way, we can understand better the terms by which this art was accepted. Throughout Europe, really, although I'm talking mostly about France, this was a style that you could find in Germany. I mean, one of the great centers of Rococo art is in Munich. And throughout Italy, there are Rococo expressions, but really in this show, we're mostly focused on the Rococo artists. And actually, the three most celebrated Rococo artists, Watteau, Boucher, and Fragonard.
How about Chardin?
So Chardin is an interesting person. He's actually worked, Fragonard was a student of Chardin, but they didn't get along. They only worked together for a very short period of time, and Chardin was too serious. He was just too tough and not interested in the same issues. So while he coexists, he's not really part of that group. I mean, we could have expanded this show if we had bigger galleries. We could have brought in people like Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun, Charles Latoile, Nicolas Lancret. There are a whole group of artists who aren't here. You need to know that too. But we decided we'd focus on the three big ones who sort of follow each other in time. But we're starting here, and I'm interested to show you these works, which actually are loans from the University of San Diego's print collection. But they give us the basis for which an artist like Watteau arrives into the French style. He actually studies with this guy, Claude Gillot. He's the artist responsible for these two works. Gillot was not a great painter, but a good painter. He showed at the Salon. And he starts to tell his students, Lancret and Watteau among them, that you don't need to paint those big, religious, mythological, historical compositions in order to be a great painter. You could show a couple of people fighting on the streets of Paris over whose carriage gets to the right of way on a street, and that could be an interesting painting too. In fact, he does a painting like that. But he also is celebrated as an illustrator. So in this case, we have an example of a work by Claude Gillot, which is part of a much bigger publication by a man named Antoine Oudard de la Motte, called Fables Nouvelles du Roi, which means the new fables of the king, a kind of updating of Aesop's fables for an 18th, actually in this case, late 17th century audience. And here he shows, I picked this illustration specifically because he gives us a view of an artist's studio, right? So you'll have to get up close. It's called the portrait, which is the portrait, and you see these people standing around criticizing a portrait, but there's actually a real person standing in a frame. You can see this, maybe they can't, that they're sort of arguing in this silly way about how realistic the work is, when in fact it's a real person, not a piece of art. So it's the kind of lighthearted, moralizing work that the Rococo artists who succeeded Gillot were interested in. The same you could say for this engraving above it, which is, and you need to know this, designed by Gillot but engraved by somebody else. Right? So that was a real division of labor that comes into play into artistic practices. So Watteau, who made dozens, actually hundreds of engraved works, actually probably didn't do that engraving more than a couple of times himself. Other artists were involved in the publications and the dissemination, so all of us could own a Watteau if we wanted to, but it was at some distance from his hands, right? And in this case, Gillot takes a subject that you might see versions of this by Rubens, you know, these female deities frolicking in a kind of park-like setting, and then they're interrupted by these satyrs who are coming in to bother them. But it's handled in a much lighter, breezier way than I think Rubens would have chosen to do it. And I think Gillot's students picked that up. And they say, so when, this is a good example of the fête galante. You come close, those of you who can. This is Watteau, but a work by Watteau engraved by another very important artist of this period, Charles-Nicolas Cochin. And this is demonstrative of what I was talking about, right? Here are lovely, elegant people in the latest fashions in a beautifully appointed park, playing music, maybe sitting a little too close to one another for what propriety would tell us they should be doing. They've let their hair down and other things too, and they're having fun. And Watteau says that's a good subject for a work of art, which would have been a daring thing. And to his surprise, people said, yeah, let's more of that, please. And so he becomes quite successful. He has a very short life. He's in his 30s when he dies, and this is one of his last works, and why I was so excited to bring it here, because it gives us this insight into his preferred subject matter. It's not really one of these fête galante scenes, but it's close enough, and there actually is a view, if you look carefully through that doorway, into a kind of park-like setting. But these are actors. You all know the term commedia dell'arte? So commedia dell'arte, somebody who knows a little bit about that, could they tell us?
Oh,
Please.
I don't know. It was a theater, a theater when they had different characters that
Yeah.
people recognized.
Yeah,
Commedia
so
dell'arte.
exactly. So it's an Italian term, and it means a kind of comedy, Italian comedy. In fact, this painting is called The Italian Comedians. And they are, you're exactly right, stock characters. So they tended to be these improvisational performances that traveled from town to town. You know, they'd be in Paris for a few months, and then they'd move on to Toulouse or another place and do their work. Often they seized on contemporary events and sort of made their performances related to those events, and they were controversial. But you didn't have to go to every performance to know that this is Harlequin, or that this is Pantalon, or this is Scaramouche, or this is Pierrot, because they wore certain costumes in every performance. And there were certain expectations of the characters that they would do certain things. So Pierrot is always the sad, melancholy clown. And you knew that he was going to perform that role for you. It's an interesting problem for scholars of this painting, because some have suggested that that figure of Pierrot in the center, surrounded by all these other comedians who seem more or less to be acknowledging him formally or informally, some scholars have suggested that that's a self-portrait of Watteau, which is even more interesting when you think about the fact that at this moment the Commedia dell'arte, the Italian comedians, were actually thrown out of France. They could not perform there because they had insulted the king. And it's even more interesting when you think that this is a painting that Watteau does at the very end of his life when he's living in England. So he is like the Commedia dell'arte performers, out of his home country, maybe, I'm not entirely convinced, although I think it makes it interesting to think this might be a self-portrait. Why would Watteau show himself as part of this controversial cultural outcast group and show himself in the center of this scene? Sort of the focus of attention, but also, estranged.
Was he always sad?
He
Well-
was a super successful artist.
He's sick, and he's always been sickly, and he's probably dying from tuberculosis, so
He was.
he may be melancholic for that reason.
Yeah,
And he's not in his home country, so he's kind of got some kind of an enforced exile here.
yeah.
Or maybe he saw himself as a stock character, the way all of these are, as the artist.
Yeah.
The stock understood that way.
Is there a connection to the troubadour tradition?
Yeah, I think
earlier?
so.
Yeah.
So I think, as I understand, I'm not a scholar of European theater history, but I think that these characters begin to circulate and perform in these traveling bands in the middle of the 17th century. By this time it was well established, but it probably grows out of that earlier troubadour practice and these narrated tales. But in this case, the Commedia dell'arte, you never knew what you were going to get. It wasn't the same performance from night to night. It was a kind of spontaneous thing. And I think all the good suggestions that you had could be true. I mean, that's what a good painting does, is it inspires lots of possible interpretations. We can't know for sure. There are even some scholars who don't think this is by Watteau. They think it's maybe after him somehow, and maybe an homage to him. The National Gallery does not think so, I should tell you.
Right.
There's a long explanation on their website of why this is definitely by Watteau and not by some follower.
The painting, is that a painting behind his head? It looks like he's standing maybe in front of one of his own paintings.
Yeah, which is interesting, right?
Yeah.
But I read it this way, and you
Looking
can
through a
disagree
door,
with me.
yeah.
We're looking through this, they're in some sort of theatrical, stage-like space.
Yeah.
He's sort of being regarded and introduced by at least this figure and the figures immediately to his right, all of whom are identifiable, by the way, and are identified on the label. And he's sort of looking back at us, sort of, oh shucks, why am I getting all this attention? But then there is this, representation, perhaps, that we're looking out into a real space, and then he might just turn around and sort of shuffle off into that space next is, I think, one of the expectations. But there's a lot of other stuff going on here, yes.
What about the flowers?
Yeah, so I think they lead our eye
Yeah.
up, and they're also a suggestion that people have been throwing flowers at the end of a performance, that this is and also that they've fallen, right? That there's a kind of decadence and sadness to this presentation of it, and around his slippered feet there are just these garlands of roses, right? Which I think is sort of a beautiful aesthetic gesture on Watteau's part. You were going to say something?
It's a masterful composition.
Yeah.
I mean, that and this print over here, the compositions are really complex and wonderful.
So complex, right? He's
Yeah.
and because he's dealing with these masked and costumed figures, you have to really work hard to understand the relationships of those bodies and how they fit together. There's these women who are looking at him and looking at us, and others who are totally disinterested in us and consumed with each other. I think when we get to Chrysanthemon's sculpture, we'll see some of that same kind of group dynamic going on. And I think this is, as I said before, paintings like this are endlessly rewarding. We could just look at them all day. Maggie.
Is the guy in red, is that called Harlequin?
Harlequin is this figure with the diamond patterned.
Well, the guy in
Okay.
red
Oh,
is
yeah.
holding a puppet.
So the scholars much smarter than me have not been able to identify several of these figures, and he's one that
But is he holding a puppet?
he's holding in his hand a little, sort of
yeah,
puppet,
exactly
a puppet
right.
on a stick. The fool, right. But these figures don't really fit into Commedia dell'arte narratives, so people struggle, and it does seem like Watteau, in a way we might naturally expect him to, is just mixing it up, right? He's who's an actor and who's real is thrown into question.
Well, did he bring people up, did they bring people up from the audience to participate in the play?
Maybe, I don't know, I'm sorry. But they're children, you know, clearly stock characters that everybody who had been to a Commedia dell'arte performance would recognize right away, and then these ambiguous figures mixed in, which I think, you know, go back to this painting where Gillot has gone to some pains to give us the fête galante as a kind of classicized subject matter, and then Watteau says, I've had enough of that, I'm going to draw on that, but change it and make it a scene of contemporary life. And here he's also making it unclear what the sources are and how we should firmly determine this. Almost every work that Watteau ever produced was engraved and published after his death, which is really helpful to people like me who want to sort of understand the complete oeuvre. And this is one of those works, but it was part of a project, and I'm going to move over here now. Watteau had enormous